Okay, thanks everyone. Hopefully I can keep you awake and out of the salty stuff and back into the green stuff. For a long, long time we've heard about the medicinal plant trade and its impact that it's having, and I'm going to talk to it again today for those who haven't heard of it, about it, just very briefly. But what very little has been done in terms of, okay, so can the wild populations actually sustain this trade? So we started some work quite a couple of years ago now to try and look at what wild populations of medicinal plants and grasslands are actually doing, and to try and get a handle on whether they can in fact supply an ever-increasing demand. So what we aim to do was to estimate the density of medicinal plant species in key grassland-dominated protected areas, and also in some areas outside of those protected areas. And this is difficult because you cannot detect grassland medicinal plant harvest after the fact. You don't know where these people are going and actually harvesting because it's secretive and illegal, all that kind of thing. But we thought we need to have a go at this, at least look at what these plants are doing. And then, to provide an indication of the value to society of these plants for medicinal plant conservation and of the protected areas, not necessarily the plants. And then to briefly assess the capacity to supply versus the demand for those. But what I'm going to do in today is I'm just going to discuss a little bit of background information on the trade for those of you who don't know about it. Combine that with a lot of what Debbie Jurt has done on grassland conservation and decline in this province, and then to estimate some key medicinal plant species density in the areas and their value, both inside and outside of protected areas, and to try and get some kind of story on the demand versus the potential supply, and then try and pull all of this kind of thing together and come up with some sort of overall broad brushstroke story. All right, the medicinal plant trade. As we all know about, in this country, traditional healers are consulted by a large proportion of the population. Indigenous plants are used by traditional healers to divine and to treat. Conservation of these plants used to be done by various customary conservation practices, but those have largely broken down for a whole bunch of reasons, and it's now become quite commercial. Well, not now, it has been for several decades now. Why has this happened? This is a photo taken in Izimbuzeni market in Umlazi at the time we were busy collecting data to do a book which many of you have got. Well, population growth coupled with rapid urbanization has created a demand, and people in rural areas are unemployed. Many of them have very poor formal or little formal education, but they do know their plants, particularly the women. So there's an opportunity there. They're collecting medicinal plants, taking them to the urban areas to try and eke out some sort of living. Yeah, high unemployment rate. We have the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which has contributed a lot. Western medicine is perceived to be expensive, and relative to what you can go and buy in a formal market, it is expensive. Research has found that 97% of users will choose traditional medicine over a Western medicine for certain ailments, not for everything. As I've alluded to, it is still the cheapest form of healthcare. You can still go and buy a raw plant or a mix of raw plants from an informal market for 15 to 20 rand and use it to treat. And then what I've called the tragedy of the commons is that pretty much the resources and the land out there is seen as a free-for-all. There's no real resource ownership or responsibility for the use of that private land, communal land, whatever. It's all seen as a resource that people can go and get. And it's largely a case of, if I don't take a population of plants or a group of bulbs, someone else will. So the resource tends to get a bit mined. 72% of the population uses traditional medicine from research that has been done over the last 10, 15 years. Contributes an estimated 2.9 billion to the national economy. This will have increased quite a lot since this work was done. And I can promise you now that SARS sees very little of that. It's a very hidden, informal economy. More than 20,000 tons of plant material used. That will also, since the time that this work was done, will have increased quite a lot. And we know that over 1,000 plant species are used, and of which at least 770 are traded. And the trade seems, it very seldom substitutes one plant for another. It seems to add plants to and resources to the whole list of traditional medicine. We know that over 2,500 tons of plants are harvested from grasslands in KZN annually. If you picture 2,500 1-ton bucky loads of plants, that is a lot. They're mainly underground plants, so the bulbs, corms, roots. So the plants are removed from the system. And these plants are also very vulnerable to overexploitation for that reason. They are generally long-lived. We've got silver bulbs that we've found in confiscations that are easily 70 to 80 years old, 50 kilogram sacks full of them, and lots. They're removed from the system. They're slow growing. They don't produce a lot of seed. So all of these things make them highly vulnerable to overexploitation. Then grasslands, moving on to the grassland story to try and pull this together and how grasslands can actually support this trade. It's generally poorly conserved in the country, with about 2% formally conserved. More than 40% is irreversibly transformed. A major proportion of this is in fact in the Drakensberg, but that has a limited grassland type. And I'll talk a bit more about it as we go, but also the loss of grassland to crops, plantations, urban development is ever increasing. And these famous maps by Debbie, many of you have seen them, and I think there are probably some updated ones to this, but you can see how from the original extent to 2008, and probably moving on, it's a whole lot worse now, how the grassland is in fact declining in this province. John, putting some numbers to that, looking at the way it's at grassland area declined between 2008 between 2008 and in those years that work was done, you're looking at about a 6% decline in grassland area in this province every year. Okay, and that doesn't take into account the estimated 35% of those grasslands that are secondary grasslands, so that means they've been overgrazed or ploughed, and so the biodiversity just isn't there. They're functional as a grassland, but the biodiversity is not there, and hence the medicinal plant populations are also not there. Okay. So what did we do? We put together a little monitoring project that we looked at measuring the densities of key medicinal plant species. We looked at in 7 grassland-dominated protected areas in the KZN Midlands. I'll show you a map in a minute. And then 5 areas outside of those between 2006 and 2012. I'm not going to bore everybody with methods and stats and all of that. If anybody's interested I haven't got to that yet, which I'll tell you anyway. But anyway, if anybody's interested in the details of the methods, you can talk to me afterwards, but I'll put everyone to sleep if I go there now. But it's very simple. All we did at each site was 300 meter by 4 meter transect was sampled. We went back at the same time, as far as we could get, the same time every year. We did total counts in those 6 years. And then to try and get an estimate of value in terms of monetary value of these plants in the wild, we used market monitoring data that we had collected for many years as well in terms of rand value. And we managed to combine that with these and to try and get some kind of estimate of value. You probably can't see this map all too well here, but the sites ranged in the Midlands from Chelmsford in the north down to also Mount Curry in the south. So there were several spread right through the grassland reserves and outside of them in the KZN Midlands. Results. Okay, as I said, this is a very broad brushstroke approach at this stage. I haven't gone into the details of each species. I've lumped all of the species together for all of the reserves and tried to come up with some trends, some very broad trends of what these plants are doing in and outside of protected areas. And you can see inside protected areas, there's a very slight upward, sort of stable trend. Outside, decreasing. Now, I cannot tell you why this is the case. I cannot attribute it to harvest or anything like that, but it is as it is, and we need to delve deeper into these data to try and pull out some other bits and pieces and as to try and explain what is happening here. But basically, there is a 21% lower medicinal plant density and biomass outside of protected areas from the data that we have compared to inside, which I think is quite significant. And yes, that might vary between species and different areas, but overall this is what we are seeing. We were able to put some biomass data to the number of plants as well, because we've got many, many years of confiscations and where we've been able to measure the masses of the various species. So we've got very good mean mass data for a lot of species, so we were able to put biomass data. So you're looking at about a ton of key medicinal plant species per hectare on average in these grassland protected areas, inside protected areas, compared to outside where it's about 0.8 of a ton. Just to put a value on it, which I'm not too sure how much this will mean, but anyway, it's there. Looking at the street values in the markets on average street values of the plants that were monitored, you're looking at about a value of about 60 million rand in terms of street value of the plants that are of the estimated densities of plants in grasslands in this province. It's a whole lot more than that when you value add with traditional healers, consultation and mixing and all of that. So that's just a very rough, low value to what this is. So, what is the capacity to supply versus the demand for these grassland plants? What I tried to do here, if it actually moves on, there we go, just to try and develop a couple of scenarios, and I don't want you to worry too much about the slide. Rather, the thing to take home from this is that, surprise, surprise, the demand is going up, and we know it's going up by at least 10% a year. But the capacity of grasslands to produce is going down. And yes, most of the plants are coming from outside of protected areas. So what this is going to do, we could probably model this and come up with a year at which the tipping point is going to be when there's nothing left outside of protected areas anymore, and there's going to be even more pressure put on inside protected areas, which is starting to happen already. We're seeing more and more confiscations happening where people have actually gone into protected areas and gone and collected 60, 70 sacks full of plants. So, yeah, it's likely that the plants are being harvested at about 1% annually, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we don't know anything or very little about life history strategies of a lot of these. So we need to get into that a little bit more, particularly with the bulbous species. We don't know what the replacement rates are. So together with the declining grassland areas and stuff, I think it may not be actually sustainable. As I've said before, the life forms and the parts used of the high demand plants are rendered invulnerable to overexploitation. And the percentage harvest appears to biomass appears low, but these populations are not evenly distributed. So you'll get a patch of, let's say, psyllid bulbs in one place that isn't touched, but in another place where the people know about them, it gets mined. There's land tenure differences. Some on private land and in some communal land, the land managers know about this issue. They are aware of it. They keep their eyes open. They keep people off their properties. Other areas it doesn't happen. So this harvest is not evenly distributed around these grasslands. So there are areas where a lot of these plants are getting extirpated or completely wiped out in some areas, and in other areas they're abundant. And this also leads to another problem where people perceive in an area, they say, yeah, but there's lots of these plants here. But they don't see the bigger picture, and that overall they're declining a lot. So there are a lot of complexities to this that it's not an easy story to come up to figure out. But just to conclude then, the initial trends and the estimates are presented here to show that that inside and outside there is a difference, with high densities inside than outside. 21% higher inside than outside. These densities do vary considerably on an annual basis. It doesn't stay constant. The same transects you go to year after year, you get different numbers of plants there. There are a whole bunch of potential reasons for that. Fire, grazing management, all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to go into that now, but it's not constant where we know that there isn't any harvesting going on at all. So there is a lot of variation. The capacity of the grassland to supply the increasing trade is decreasing annually. I think we can confidently say that. And that's also due a lot, not necessarily to overexploitation of the plants, but to a combination of land use change, possible overexploitation, and of the species for the commercial trade. And then final slide, and not the least important by any means, still acknowledge my colleagues Henry Saylor for his huge assistance in field work and data collection over those years. Debbie's work for producing these maps and all the work that she's done in the grasslands, and then Heidi Snyman's helped me a lot with map production and things like that. Thanks very much.